Hello, welcome to another episode of Top3Tech. Today we're going to be reviewing the XFX SWFT 210 AMD Radeon RX 6600. Not the XT, the non-XT version. But, you know, XFX always has their crazy little boxes, verticals. This one's pretty skinny compared to the, what was it, the Merc 6700 XT we had on the channel last time. Go ahead and check that one out if you want. If not, the results will be on the benchmark. But quick reminder, that one was on day one drivers. I haven't been able to test it since, so that one is probably, the results are probably a little skewed. But anyways, let's go ahead and get to the unboxing, then the benchmarks, and we'll go from here. Looks like I went ahead and cut the seal. Yes, this one comes with the seal. Gigabyte, we're looking at you. I went ahead and cut the seal and opened this flap so I wouldn't struggle as much opening it. But other than that, this is gonna be the first time first time that I see the contents inside. As long as you guys follow me, we're gonna do this together, okay? So look at that, the black box already looks nice. Has the foam padding on top. It comes with the warranty card. Ooh, check that out. XFX quick guide. Before installation, read first. It lets you know how to connect these things. You know. Warranty card. Monitor connections, troubleshooting, display adapters, BIOS switch. So it comes with the BIOS switch. Let's see what it says about the BIOS switch. Oh, if your graphics card is equipped with dual BIOS, the Switch 2 is located. Alright, they messed up on that part. The Switch 2 is located near the power connections on the edge. The Switch 2 is located near the power connections on the edge of the card's PCB. The default shipping position is with the switch toggle closest to the power connectors. This is the performance BIOS. When the switch is toggled closer to the monitor outputs, the BIOS will be in silent mode or mining mode depending on your model card. Mining mode, interesting. So if this does have the switches, then closest to the connectors is where you'll find the performance mode. Anyways, it says stop important driver information. No driver disk included in this product. Please connect to the internet to download the latest drivers to receive all the latest optimizations and bug fixes. Please visit one of the following websites to download the latest driver package and software. I always just go to AMD, type in AMD 6600 drivers, and it'll take you automatically there. But if not, it says go to xfxforce.com. And then the last thing that's in here is this card. Jeez, tiny little guy. Well, let's go ahead and open up and get a closer look. So we are looking at a dual fan design. It is a little wider. The length of this card is 241 millimeters. The back of it is plain, no RGB in sight. It does say XFX, have little vents, and it does have the heat vent on the right side of the card. Of course, we got Radeon and XFX printed on there in white. They don't light up, no RGB. It is an 8-pin. Also, it does have a BIOS switch, performance on the right, which it is on right now, and silent mode on the left. We got these little heat pipes, two, it looks like. It's kind of crazy comparing them to other cards. The PCIe slot does have a plastic cover on it that says XFX. And it does have 3 display ports and 1 HDMI. Now to one of my favorite part of the videos is comparing them to the other GPUs. So we got the 6600, the 6600 XT, that's a triple fan, the 6700 XT, the 6800, and the 6800 XT. And anyone wants to know, This one and this one are mine. I'm gonna sell them back to the people locally probably. That way they have their chance to get them for a good price. This one is my cousin's, and these two are my personal ones. So if anyone's getting crazy saying that, you know, what do I need all these cards for? I do review them. But anyways, since I do have them, I figured we might as well compare them. So obviously the 2 fan is way smaller. It actually pretty much feels like it weighs nothing. But the front of the design's not too bad, even though you probably won't see it. I mean, compared to this two-toned one, I mean, it's kind of not fair comparing this card to these, but we are. I mean, check out the length difference too. And there it is compared to the 6700, the 6800, and then the 6800 XT. That's a thick boy there. I mean, I don't know if you'd be able to tell if there is a thickness difference or not between these guys, but let's see. Oh yeah, see, you could tell just from the 6600 XT, that triple fan one. Let me see if I can clear that up. There you go. And look in the back. Yeah, so you see it gets a little higher, thicker as the cards go along. And then the length, you can see that sticking out from right there. But they might not be aligned properly either. But if we're to compare the fronts of these cards, obviously my favorite is the ASRock Gaming. It has a wild design. This front fan lights up too, I believe. And those 3 fans light up, and the rest don't. And when we compare the backs of these cards, this is where it gets interesting. That plain black look is pretty simple, but for what you pay for, I guess that's what people want. It's probably a smaller card, so they're probably going to put it in PCs you can't see. But the Gigabyte does have that grayish design. It's a little darker in person, but the lights are making it look a little brighter. But I like when they do a different design other than black. Here's the Phantom Gaming. Even though I like the front of this card, I really do not like the back, especially because it says these crazy words, look fast, mysterious. What's this other one say? Unbeatable. Like, really? What is that supposed to mean? Well, let me zoom back in. And then we got the Pulse. I really like that design. I wish that was LED, but some people get mad when I say these cards are expensive and I wish they put LED on them. And then of course we got the Nitro Plus design. That looks amazing. And you guys already know what I'm gonna pick, but versus the Gigabyte, I'd pick the Gigabyte. Versus the ASRock, I'd pick the ASRock. Versus the Pulse, I'd pick the Pulse. And of course, I'd pick the Nitro over the XFX, and I'd pick it over all these cards. That might not be fair, but this design's a little too plain for me. Well, let's compare the sides of these cards. And by the looks of it, it looks like this SWFT does not have RGB. For everyone asking me on my Merc video, the 6700 XT, how come their light doesn't turn on, their Radeon or their XFX, whatever, you probably have the SWFT. That's the most common answer I've gotten. Everyone keeps asking me, their light doesn't turn on, and they end up not having the Merc. Other than that, I do not know why your light doesn't turn on. So, sorry to hear that, but good luck from there. Anyways, this is the whole side of them. They all got RGB except for this SWFT. The Gigabyte's supposed to light up. The Phantom Gaming lights up. Actually, the Sapphire Radeon doesn't have RGB. And then right here, the Sapphire lights up, and then this lights up too. There's a bar, LED bar. So we're going to compare the sides. I think my favorite would be, I'm going to have to go with that Radeon one. It reminds me of the Raider Stadium. But the Phantom Gaming looks pretty dope too. Now that we saw the comparison of the cards, let's see how this looks inside of the PC, the Top3Tech PC. Now that we got the card inside, let's go ahead and plug it in and see how everything looks like with the lights on. Tiny thing, huh? This is how everything looks like turned on. Not too shabby. I left it white because the lettering on the Radeon and XFX are white, or else I would have turned it red for AMD. But as you can see, there is no lighting on this card. Every lighting that's on here is from the lights all around it. And on top, there's no lighting now as well. So if you just want a plain black card that's small, that might fit in your PC, that's the perfect card for you. Let's head on over to the benchmarks, guys. And of course, everybody's favorite part, the benchmarks. Before we get started, let me introduce you to the Top3Tech PC specs. We have an Asus X570 TUF Gaming Plus Wi-Fi motherboard. We have a Ryzen 7 5800X CPU. We got 32 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance RAM at 3200 megahertz. And of course, the GPU that we are testing today is the XFX Speedster SWFT 210 RX 6600 non-XT. It does have a boost clock of 2491 megahertz, a game clock of 2044 megahertz, and the core clock of 1626 megahertz. And it is running on 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory. It is an RDNA 2 architecture, and the minimum recommended watts for this would be a 500 watt PSU. So let's get started. And to start off the benchmarks, we do have the 3D Mark benchmarks. We start off with Time Spy. It is a DirectX 12 benchmark. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT is on the top of the chart with 16,632 Time Spy score. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 has a 14,294 Time Spy score. We go to the MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti with the 14,013 Time Spy score. We go to the Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT, leading that group at 13,031 Time Spy score. Then on the bottom of the 6700 XT group is the Sapphire Pulse with 11,386 Time Spy score. And then we have the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT with 9,905 Time Spy score. Then we have the PMY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 with the Time Spy score of 8,830. And then our card today, the XFX Speedster SWFT 210 6600, is on the bottom of the list with 8,366 Time Spy score. When we switch over to the Firestrike 3D Mark benchmark, the max temperatures this card hit was 59 degrees. The results are pretty much the same. There's a little bit difference at the bottom. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT leads the way with the 37,708 Firestrike score. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had a 34,251 Firestrike score. We have the MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti with a 31,443 Firestrike score. We have the Asus ROG Strix leading the 6700 XT group with a 30,583 Firestrike score. The Sapphire Pulse 6700 XT is on the bottom of that group with 28,134 Firestrike score. We have the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT with a 25,868 Firestrike score. That XFX Speedster SWFT 210 6600 swapped places, and it got a 21,261 Firestrike score. And the PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 got a 20,662 Firestrike score. For the next benchmark, we have MSI Kombuster at 1440p. The max temperatures hit when testing this out was 59 degrees. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 got first place with 66 frames per second. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti got 62 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT got 51 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 got 43 frames per second. The XFX Merc 319 6700 XT got 39 frames per second. The PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 got 38 frames per second. Snuck in there. The bottom of the 6700 XT cards is the Power Color Hellhound with 36 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT got 35 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT got 31 frames per second. And then this card got on the bottom of the list with a 24 frames per second. At 1080p, when we tested out this card, the max temps hit was 59 degrees. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 is in first again with 80 frames per second. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti had 74 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 57 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had a 49 frames per second. The sneaky PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 snuck up on right here at 46 frames per second. The XFX Merc 319 led the 6700 XT group at 44 frames per second. Then we have the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT at 41 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix is on the bottom of the 6700 XT group at 37 frames per second. We have the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT at 36 frames per second. Then we have the XFX SWFT 210 6600 at 27 frames per second. pretty close to its original score at 1440p. On the next set of benchmarks, we got the Gears of War 5. It is an AMD based game, so it is preference a little more that way, but either way there's still some surprising results from last gen cards and lower tier cards. But the max temperatures hit on the Gears of 5 Ultra preset benchmark 1440p was 60 degrees. We got the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT hitting 120.8 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 hit 105.5 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT hit 90.4 frames per second. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti hit 80.3 frames per second. On the bottom of the 6700 XT group is the XFX Merc 319 at 77 frames per second. We have the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT at 71 frames per second, beating the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 at 70.6 frames per second, just barely, but still. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 66.6 frames per second. The PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 had 62.1 frames per second, and the XFX SWFT 210 6600 hit 52.8 frames per second. When we switch on over to 1080p, the max temperatures hit was also 60 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 142.9 frames per second. Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 142.7 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix leads the 6700 XT group at 129.7 frames per second. The XFX Merc 6700 XT had 108.7 frames per second, beating out the MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti at 107.8 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT it has a surprising appearance at 101.9 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 98 frames per second. The PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 was at 82.7 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 was at 81 frames per second, barely beating out the XFX SWFT 210 6600 at 79.8 frames per second. Surprising results down there. For the next benchmark, we head on over to Forza Horizon 4 Ultra Benchmark at 1440p. The max temperatures hit was 62 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT out of the way at 241.5 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 hit 211.8 frames per second. Leading the 6700 XT group was the Asus ROG Strix at 178.7 frames per second. We jump down to the MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti at 166 frames per second. We have the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 at 154.9 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 151.2 frames per second. The bottom of the 6700 XT group was the XFX Merc 319 at 138.2 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 126 frames per second. The XFX SWFT 210 6600 beat out the 3060 with 121.2 frames per second. And the PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 came in last at 109.4 frames per second. Forza Horizon 4 Ultra Benchmark at 1080p. We got the same temperatures at 62 degrees. Some of the results are similar. Bottom of it got scattered a bit. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 286.6 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 261.6 frames per second. The Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT, leading that group, is 225.8 frames per second. We jump down to the MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti with 208.3 frames per second. The Gigabyte Gaming OC 6600 XT had 202.6 frames per second. We go to the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 at 178.6 frames per second. We have this card beating a couple of cards today at the XFX SWFT 210 6600 at 169.8 frames per second. We have the XFX Merc 319 on the bottom of the 6700 XT group at 166.2 frames per second. We have the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT at 160 frames per second. Then we got the PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 and last at 136.4 frames per second. When we head on to the Forza Horizon 5 Extreme Benchmark at 1440p, this is a newer game, so I don't have as many cards tested, but the max temperatures hit was 63 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT hit 94.6 frames per second. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti hit 88 frames per second. The ASRock Phantom Gaming 6700 XT hit 86.6 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 hit 85.3 frames per second. The Gigabyte Gaming Overclock 6600 XT hit 70.7 frames per second, and the XFX Swift 210 6600 hit 60.1 frames per second. Things do get a little hotter as we jump over to the Forza Horizon 5 Extreme benchmark at 1080p. The max temperature hit was 64. This is a demanding game. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT hit 107.8 frames per second. The ASRock Phantom Gaming 6700 XT hit 104.8 frames per second. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti hit 100.2 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 hit 97.5 frames per second. The Gigabyte Gaming overclocked 6600 XT hit 85 frames per second, and the XFX Swift 210 6600 hit 75.3 frames per second. Okay, then we hop on over to the Call of Duty Cold War Ultra Campaign benchmarks. This one's going to be at 1440p. The max temperatures hit was 61 degrees. This is with DLSS on. DLSS looks pretty good for this game, so I recommend turning it on. It does help out. I'll give you both results. But anyways, the MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti leads the way with 102 frames per second, but with DLSS turned on, it jumps up to 135 frames per second. We have the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT with 131 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 91 frames per second, but with DLSS, it jumped up to 118. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 was also at 118. The Asus ROG Strix leads the 6700 XT group with 99 frames per second. We have the PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 with 67 frames per second, but with DLSS turned on, it jumped up to 92 frames per second. We went down to the XFX Merc 319 6700 XT on the bottom of that group with 86 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 5700 XT had 72 frames per second. The Gigabyte Gaming OC 6600 XT had 67 frames per second, and this card beat out the Gaming X. The XFX Swift 210 6600 had 58 frames per second, and the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 56 frames per second. When we hop on over to 1080p, we almost had the similar results. The 6800 XT and the 3070 just swapped places pretty much, but the max temperature hit was 62 degrees. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti had 139 frames per second. With the DLSS turned on, it had 165. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 129 frames per second. With DLSS on, it had 161. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 156 frames per second. Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 150 frames per second. The Power Color Red Devil led the 6700 XT group at 146 frames per second. We have the PNY Accelerate Gaming making a special appearance, 3060 with 93 frames per second. DLSS 116 frames per second. Then we have the XFX Merc 319 on the bottom of the 6700 XT group with 115 frames per second. We have the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT at 94 frames per second. We got the Gigabyte Gaming OC 6600 XT at 88 frames per second. And we have the XFX Swift 210 6600 at 86 frames per second. And then the last card was the MSI Gaming X 6600 XT at 75 frames per second. For the new benchmark, we have Call of Duty Warzone Caldera. It's not, what is it, Verdansk? It's not Verdansk anymore, so a lot of those cards that I had tested, they disappeared because I didn't have them available for Caldera. Since it's a new map, I had to redo everything. There's too many variables for Warzone as it is already. Plus, changing the map, who knows how that goes. But anyways, this benchmark is the Call of Duty Warzone Caldera high settings at 1440p. The highest that this card hit was 62 degrees. We have the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT getting 163 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 hit 120 frames per second. The ASRock Phantom Gaming 6700 XT hit 110 frames per second. The Gigabyte Gaming OC 6600 XT hit 91 frames per second. And the XFX Swift 210 6600 hit 76 frames per second. When we switch on over to 1080p, this also had a jump in temperature to 64 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 203 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 179 frames per second. The ASRock Phantom Gaming 6700 XT had 151 frames per second. The Gigabyte Gaming OC 6600 XT had 123 frames per second. The XFX Swift 210 6600 had 102 frames per second. We go to one of the most amazing and disappointing games at the same time, Cyberpunk, the Ultra preset at 1440p. The max temperature that this game hit was 63 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT leads the group at 83 frames per second. This is another game where I would recommend DLSS on. It looks pretty great. not too much of a difference. But the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 55 frames per second, with the LSS on it hit 83. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti had 54 frames per second, with the LSS on it hit 72. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 59 frames per second. Sapphire Nitro Plus 6700 XT had 57 frames per second, leading that group. On the bottom of it was the Asus ROG Strix 6700 XT, 47 frames per second. The PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 had 32 frames per second. With DLSS on, it had 44 frames per second, beating out the MSI Gaming X 5700 XT at 40 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT had 32 frames per second, and the XFX SWFT 210 6600 had 22 frames per second. Pretty much not playable at all at 1440p, well, at Ultra preset. When we head on over to the Cyberpunk Ultra preset 1080p, the max temperature hit was also 63 degrees, a little bit shuffled around on the board. The MSI Ventus 3X 3070 Ti had 87 frames per second. With the LSS on, it had 106 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT hit 91 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 hit 91 frames per second. The Sapphire Nitro Plus led the 6700 XT group at 83 frames per second. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra 3070 had 71 frames per second, but with DLSS on, it hit 81 frames per second. We had the Power Color Hellhound on the bottom of the 6700 XT group at 73 frames per second. The PNY Accelerate Gaming Rebel 3060 had 51 frames per second. With DLSS on, it did manage to hit 69 frames per second. MSI Gaming X 5700 XT hit 62 frames per second. The MSI Gaming X 6600 XT hit 60 frames per second. The Gigabyte Gaming OC 6600 XT hit 49 frames per second. And the XFX SWFT 210 6600 had 39 frames per second. So I did add 2 more games to the benchmark. We got the Shadow of the Tomb Raider highest benchmark at 1440p. That was the highest preset. The hottest that the card hit was 63 degrees. We have the Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT at 156 frames per second. We have the Sapphire Pulse 6800 at 134 frames per second. We have the ASRock Phantom Gaming at 6700 XT at 109 frames per second. And this card hit the XFX SWFT 210 6600 hit 66 frames per second. When we switched over to the Shadow of the Tomb Raider highest benchmark at 1080p, the highest temps that we hit was 64 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SC 6800 XT had 225 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 193 frames per second. The ASRock Phantom Gaming 6700 XT had 157 frames per second. And the XFX SWFT 210 6600 had 104 frames per second. The other game on the list is Assassin's Creed Valhalla Ultra High Benchmark at 1440p. Maximum temperature hit was 63 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 108 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 96 frames per second. The ASRock Phantom Gaming 6700 XT had 93 frames per second. The XFX SWFT 210 6600 had 83 frames per second. When we switched on over to 1080p, it was the same temperature at 63 degrees. The Sapphire Nitro Plus SE 6800 XT had 140 frames per second. The Sapphire Pulse 6800 had 125 frames per second. The ASRock Phantom Gaming 6700 XT had 121 frames per second. And the XFX SWFT 210 6600 had 108 frames per second. So all in all, what do I think of this card? I mean, it looks pretty great. I'm not gonna lie. It has grown a little bit on me, but what was it, 560? I got it for 560, around 560, and considering I got the Gigabyte Gaming RX 6600 XT for 590, I would recommend spending that $30 and getting the better card. But I mean, I don't know if they're all gonna be around that price point. And the 3060 was beating it in some games. They kind of were pretty close, so I think that card was around $600 too. With DLSS, it does give it that extra boost. I would probably recommend getting a 3060. But the best thing I would recommend around this price point would be the 3060 Ti. You get the bang for your buck. It is a pretty good card. It's a good entry card for 1440p as well. And for 1080p, it'll take you really far. Plus, it has DLSS too. That is my recommendations. But for small cases, I mean, it'll work pretty great. I always like RGB on my cards. No RGB is always a minus for me. But that's the card, you guys. I try to give you the best results that I can. I try to give you the open boxing so you can check out what you like from the card or not. So hopefully I helped make you hopefully I helped you guys make the right decision, because buying GPUs is pretty hard as it is, and then, you know, not knowing what you're getting sucks too. So I hope you guys have a good day, and hit like and subscribe, and you know the rest. Peace. Thank you for watching another video from Top3 Entertainment. I hope you hit like and subscribe. Also, I'm going to have a recommended playlist, a recommended video right here, so make sure to click that as well. I appreciate you guys tuning in, whether it be to the Top3Tech, Top3 Gaming, or the Why Not Me podcast. You guys are dope. I hope to see you guys in the next video. And of course, let's grow this thing together. Peace. Peace. Peace.